The hall swallowed light. Sarah stood at its entrance and watched the late afternoon sun stop at the threshold as if hitting an invisible wall, unable to penetrate the darkness beyond. Everyone in the capital knew about this place. The Hall of Echoes, they called it, though no one alive could remember why. It had been sealed for 60 years, the doors locked by order of the previous king, and in all that time no one had entered. Not because they couldn't, but because everyone who got close felt something that made them turn away. A presence in the darkness, a weight that pressed against the chest like a hand saying no. But Sarah had nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left to lose do things that terrify everyone else. She pushed the door open and stepped into the dark. She was 24 years old and had been dying for 6 months. The physicians called it the wasting sickness, a disease that had no cure and no explanation, that ate away at people from the inside until they were hollow shells waiting to stop breathing. She'd watched it take her mother 3 years ago, slowly robbing her of strength, of presence, of life itself. Now it was Sarah's turn. She could feel it in her bones, in the way food had stopped tasting like anything, in how every morning she woke up feeling less solid, less real, as if she were fading from the world 1 degree at a time. The physicians had given her 6 months. That was 5 months and 3 weeks ago. She had perhaps a week left, maybe less, and she was tired of waiting to disappear. The capital city of Varan sprawled across 7 hills, a maze of stone and ambition, where nobles played their games and common people struggled to survive. Sarah had been born in the lower districts, daughter of a seamstress, granddaughter of a seamstress, great-granddaughter of a seamstress. She'd learned the trade young, her small fingers quick with needle and thread, and by 16 she was good enough to work in the upper districts, mending the clothes of people who'd never look her in the eye. It was honest work, hard work, the kind of work that should have given her a stable life, a husband, eventually children, a quiet death in old age surrounded by family. But the wasting sickness didn't care about shoulds. It took who it wanted when it wanted and left nothing but grief in its wake. The Hall of Echoes stood in the old palace district, a massive structure that predated the current royal family by centuries. It had been built by the Valemere dynasty, rulers who'd held power long before the modern kingdom formed, and their architectural ambitions showed. The hall was enormous, capable of holding 1,000 people easily, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness, even when the space was lit. The walls were carved with murals depicting scenes no one could quite interpret. Battles, maybe, or rituals, or something else entirely, something the Valemere had understood, but that had been lost with their fall. For generations the hall had been used for ceremonies, coronations, important gatherings, until 60 years ago when the previous king had walked in for what should have been a routine council meeting and walked out 3 hours later with an expression of absolute terror. He'd ordered the hall sealed immediately, posted guards at the entrance, and declared that no one was to enter on pain of death. When his advisers asked why, he'd said only that there was something in the darkness that saw too much, something that should never be disturbed. The guards had been removed after his death 30 years ago. The threat of execution lifted, but the hall remained closed, because everyone who approached felt it. That presence, that weight, that sense of being watched by something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. so people stayed away, chose other venues for gatherings, let the hall sink into obscurity and rumor, and for 60 years it waited in the dark. Sarah had heard all the stories. Growing up in the lower districts, you heard everything eventually. The nobles whispered that the hall was haunted, that the Valemere king who'd built it had sealed something there, some power or spirit or remnant of old magic that still lingered. Common folk said it was cursed, that anyone who entered would be driven mad by what they saw. The priests claimed it was a holy place that had been corrupted, that demons nested in the shadows waiting for foolish souls to stumble in. Everyone agreed on one thing: stay away. The hall was dangerous in ways that couldn't be explained, only felt. But Sarah had stopped caring about danger 5 months and 3 weeks ago, when the physician had looked at her with that expression of professional sympathy and said 6 months, maybe less. Something inside her had broken free of fear. What was danger to someone already dying? What was risk to someone with no future? She'd spent the intervening months finishing her commissions, making sure her few possessions were distributed to people who could use them, saying goodbye to friends in ways they didn't recognize as final. And she'd thought about the Hall of Echoes, about how it sat there in the old palace district, sealed and forgotten, holding something that terrified everyone, about how she'd always wondered what was so terrible that a king would lock it away and never speak of it again. She'd gone to the hall 3 days ago, planning to enter then, but she'd stood at the entrance for an hour, feeling that weight, that presence, that sense of being watched, and her courage had failed. She'd turned away and returned to her small room in the lower districts, ashamed of her own fear. But the wasting sickness had gotten worse overnight. She'd woken up unable to stand without leaning on furniture, had looked in her cracked mirror and barely recognized a hollow-eyed woman staring back, had realized with absolute certainty that she had days left, not weeks, and something had crystallized in her mind. She didn't want to die in her bed, wasting away in a room that smelled of sickness and regret. She wanted to die doing something, seeing something, being somewhere that mattered, even if she didn't understand why it mattered. She wanted to walk into the dark and see what everyone else was too afraid to face. So she'd come back, dressed in her best clothes, the dark blue dress she wore to important commissions, the one that made her feel like she mattered even when clients looked through her. She'd walk through the city as the sun set, watching the light turn gold on the 7 hills, memorizing the sight because she knew she wouldn't see another sunset. And she'd arrived at the Hall of Echoes as night began to fall, when the shadows were deepest and the presence inside felt strongest. She'd put her hand on the door and felt it push back, felt that weight trying to warn her away, but she'd pushed harder, and the door had opened. The darkness inside was absolute, not the darkness of a room at night, but something deeper, thicker, as if light had never existed here, as if the space itself rejected illumination. Sarah stepped through the entrance and heard the door close behind her with a sound like finality. She waited for her eyes to adjust, but they didn't. The darkness remained total. She could feel space around her, the vastness of the hall extending in all directions, but she couldn't see any of it. Only dark, only the sense of being very small in something very large. She took a step forward. Her footstep echoed, but the echo was wrong. It came back too quickly and from the wrong direction. as if the hall's geometry didn't follow normal rules. She took another step, another echo, equally wrong. She stopped and stood still, listening. There was something else beneath the echoes. A sound so low it was more vibration than noise. Like breathing, maybe. Or like the space itself was alive and aware of her intrusion. Then she saw it. Not a light, but a lessening of darkness. A gray shape in the black, vertical and humanoid, but far too tall. It stood perhaps 50 feet away, though distance was hard to judge in the dark, completely motionless. Watching her, she could feel its attention like a physical thing, a beam of focus that picked her out from the darkness and held her pinned. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her second instinct was to speak, but her throat had closed. So she just stood there, staring at the shape, and the shape stared back. You entered. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not spoken aloud, but vibrating through the air, through the floor, through her bones. A statement, not a question. An observation made by something that rarely needed to observe because nothing changed in its world. She tried to answer and managed only a whisper. Yes, the shape didn't move. In 60 years, no one has entered. They feel the weight and they turn away. But you didn't. Why? Sarah swallowed and found her voice thin and shaking, but present. Because I'm dying. Because I have a week left, and I wanted to see what everyone was afraid of. Because being afraid of dying seemed pointless, when I'm already dying of something else. The shape was silent for a long moment. Then it moved, gliding forward without walking, simply becoming closer, without crossing the distance between them. As it approached, details emerged from the darkness. Not a shape, but a figure, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, wrapped in robes or shadows, or something that flowed like cloth, but moved like smoke. The face was visible but wrong, features that suggested humanity, but didn't commit to it. High cheekbones that were too sharp, eyes that were too large and too dark and too knowing. A mouth that had forgotten how to smile, but remembered how to judge, and around it all, an aura of absolute authority. This was not something that asked permission or explained itself. This was something that simply was, and everything else had to accommodate that existence. I am Kale, the figure said. Once I was king of the Vale Mere. Now I am the shadow of that king, the remnant left behind when the living king went to dust. I remain because I made a choice that bound me here, a duty I cannot abandon, even in death. And for 60 years I have waited in this hall, watching the world through the cracks in the door, seeing people approach and turn away, seeing the living choose fear over curiosity, safety over truth. You are the first in 6 decades to choose differently. His enormous eyes fixed on her with terrible focus. Tell me your name. Sarah. Her voice was steadier now. Sarah Van, seamstress, 24 years old, dying of the wasting sickness. Nothing special. Nothing important. Just someone who wanted to see the shadows before she became one. Cale tilted his head, a gesture that looked almost curious in something that shouldn't be capable of curiosity. The wasting sickness. I know it. I remember it from my living days. There was no cure then, and I suspect there is none now. It takes the young most often, those with their whole lives ahead of them. A cruel disease, an efficient one. He paused. How long? Days. Maybe a week if I'm unlucky. I can feel it getting faster. I came here because I didn't want to die in my bed. I wanted to die somewhere that mattered. And you think this hall matters?" His voice carried something that might have been amusement or might have been sadness. It was hard to tell was something that existed between life and death. I don't know. But everyone's afraid of it, and I wanted to understand why. I wanted to see what was so terrible that a king would lock it away forever. Cale moved closer until he was standing directly before her, his enormous presence filling her entire field of vision. What that king saw was me, or rather what I showed him. When he entered 60 years ago, he was corrupt. A ruler who'd forgotten what it meant to serve, who'd turned his position into personal gain and let his people suffer for his comfort. I showed him the truth of what he was. Let him see himself through the eyes of every person he'd harmed. Let him feel the weight of his failures. He left this hall understanding that he was not fit to rule, and rather than accept that truth, he sealed the doors and pretended I didn't exist. He paused. Most rulers would do the same. Most people would. Truth is harder to face than darkness. Sarah stared up at him, feeling dizzy from the angle, but unable to look away. What truth did you show him? That kingship is a burden, not a right. That power is a responsibility to those who have none. That the measure of a ruler is not in what they take, but in what they give. He'd forgotten all of that, traded it for comfort and ease. I reminded him, and he couldn't bear the reminder. Cale's huge eyes studied her. But you are not a ruler. You have no power to abuse, no responsibility to neglect. What truth would I show you? I don't know. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe that I wasted my life. Maybe that I could have done more, been more, if I'd been braver. Maybe that dying young means all my potential dies with me. She looked down at her hands, thin and trembling. I'm a seamstress. I mend clothes. That's all I've ever done, all I'll ever do. Maybe the truth is that I'm no one, that my life didn't matter, that the world won't notice when I'm gone. Cale was silent for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He knelt. The gesture was smooth, practiced, the way a king might kneel before something worthy of respect. It brought his face level with hers, those enormous eyes just inches away. I have been in these shadows for 300 years, he said quietly. I have watched the world through cracks and listened to the living pass by without entering. I have seen thousands of people approach these doors and turn away. Nobles who could have faced me but chose comfort over truth. Warriors who could have entered but chose safety over challenge. Scholars who could have learned from me but chose easy knowledge over hard wisdom. For 60 years since that coward king sealed the doors, no one has had the courage to step into this dark. No one except you. He paused. You think your life doesn't matter because you mend clothes. But you are the only person in 6 decades brave enough to face what everyone else fears. That matters. That speaks to a strength most rulers never possess. Sarah felt something hot in her throat. Tears, maybe, or the ghost of tears from someone too dried out to cry. I'm not brave, I'm dying. There's a difference. Is there? Cale's voice was soft, almost gentle. Bravery is doing what needs to be done despite fear. You came here afraid. You pushed through the weight at the door even though it told you to turn away. You stepped into absolute darkness without knowing what you'd find. You spoke to something that should terrify you. That is bravery. Your dying doesn't diminish it. If anything, it makes it greater. You could have spent your last days in comfort, surrounded by what little you have. Instead, you spent them seeking truth in shadows. That is not the action of someone whose life doesn't matter. The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent 5 months accepting that she'd wasted her life, that she'd be forgotten as soon as she was buried, that the world would continue exactly as it had, with no acknowledgment that she'd ever existed. But this Shadow King, this remnant of ancient power, was telling her that her life mattered because she'd done one brave thing, because she'd entered a hall no one else dared to enter. Why do you stay here? The question came out before she could stop it. You're dead, or mostly dead. You could let go. Move on to whatever comes after. Why stay in these shadows for 300 years? Because I made a vow. Cale stood slowly, returning to his full towering height. When I was living, I ruled the Valemere during a time of great corruption. Kings before me had turned the throne into a tool for personal gain, had forgotten that they existed to serve their people. I tried to change that. I tried to rule justly, to use power for good rather than comfort. But I knew that after my death, the corruption would return. My children, my descendants, they would eventually fall into the same patterns. Power corrupts, given enough time. So I made a choice. I bound my essence to this hall, created a space where truth could not be avoided. I vowed that any ruler who entered would see themselves clearly, would face what they truly were, without the comfortable lies they told themselves. I thought it would keep them honest, keep them humble. Instead, they simply stopped entering. He gestured at the empty hall. They locked the doors and pretended I didn't exist. Easier than facing uncomfortable truth. Sarah looked around the vast, dark space. So you've been here for 300 years, waiting for rulers who never come. That sounds like torture. It is, but it is necessary torture. Because occasionally, very occasionally, someone enters who isn't a ruler. Someone who comes seeking truth rather than avoiding it. Someone like you. And in those moments, my existence has purpose beyond waiting. He looked down at her with those enormous dark eyes. You came here to die somewhere that mattered. I can give you that. Not by ending your life early, but by showing you the truth of what your life has been. Would you like to see it? Sarah's heart raced. The wasting sickness made her chest tight, her breathing shallow, but beneath it she felt something else. Curiosity. The same curiosity that had brought her to this hall. Yes. Cale extended his hand, and it was wrong in the same way his face was wrong. Too long, too many joints, fingers that bent in directions human fingers shouldn't. But the gesture was clear. Come. She took his hand, and it was cold, but not unpleasant, solid, despite looking like it was made of smoke. He led her deeper into the hall, into darkness that should have been impassable, but parted before him like water. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. And as they walked, the darkness began to change. Shapes emerged. Not physical objects, but memories. Her memories pulled from her mind and projected into the space around them. She saw herself at 7 years old, learning to thread a needle from her mother. The memory was so vivid she could smell the lamp oil, hear the sounds of the street outside their small apartment. Her mother's hands guiding hers, patient and steady. This is the foundation of everything, her mother said in the memory. The first stitch. get this right and everything else follows. Young Sarah concentrated with absolute focus, and when she finally managed to thread the needle herself, her mother smiled. A small smile, nothing dramatic, but filled with genuine pride. That memory faded and another appeared. Sarah at 14, finishing her first solo commission. A tear in a merchant's coat, simple repair work, but she'd been terrified of making a mistake. She'd spent an hour on stitches that should have taken 10 minutes, checking and rechecking her work. When she delivered the coat, the merchant had examined it with critical eyes, and then nodded. Good work, clean stitches. You'll do well. 2 sentences that had filled her with a pride she'd never forgotten. The memories continued flowing around them like water. Sarah at 16, getting her first commission in the upper districts. Sarah at 18, fixing a noble's dress so skillfully that the woman had recommended her to friends. Sarah at 20, working late into the night to finish an order, her fingers cramping, but refusing to stop because she'd made a promise, and she kept her promises. Dozens of small moments that had felt insignificant while living them, but now, seen through Cale's eyes, revealed themselves as something else. Moments of craftsmanship, of dedication, of taking pride in work that others overlooked. These are the threads you've woven, Cale said, his voice echoing in the dark. Not just in cloth, but in the world. Every garment you mended, every stitch you placed with care, you were doing more than repairing fabric. You were preserving, extending the life of things that mattered to people, making it possible for a poor family to keep their clothes 1 more year, allowing a noble to wear a cherished dress to 1 more event. Small actions, yes, but they ripple. He gestured and more memories appeared. A woman wearing the dress Sarah had mended at 18, the noble who'd recommended her to friends. That recommendation had led to 3 more commissions that month, income that had let Sarah's mother see a better physician when she'd gotten sick. The physician hadn't been able to cure the wasting sickness, but he'd made the last months more comfortable, less painful. That comfort existed because Sarah had done good work on a dress 2 years earlier. The connection was invisible in the moment, but Cale showed her the thread connecting cause and effect. More memories. A boy wearing a coat Sarah had repaired, staying warm through a brutal winter that would have killed him otherwise. A merchant wearing trousers she'd mended, presenting well at a meeting that resulted in a contract that employed 20 people for a year. A woman wearing a cloak Sarah had saved from the rag pile, passing it down to her daughter, who wore it while studying to become a physician herself. Each memory showed how Sarah's work had mattered in ways she'd never known, never suspected. Small ripples in a vast ocean, but ripples nonetheless. Evidence that her life had touched others, had changed things, had mattered. You see? Cale's voice was gentle. You think you're no one because you mend clothes. But mending is sacred work. It is the act of taking what is broken and making it whole, of preserving what already exists rather than always seeking new things, of caring for the overlooked and the damaged. Kings build monuments that crumble. Warriors win battles that are forgotten. But the seamstress who repairs a child's coat so they can stay warm through winter, that act echoes forever in the life she saves. Your work is not small, it is simply quiet, and the world teaches us to value noise over substance. Sarah stared at the memories swirling around her, seeing her life from an angle she'd never considered. She'd always thought of herself as invisible, unimportant, someone who would die without leaving a mark. But Cale was showing her the marks she'd left, the quiet, unnoticed ways her existence had mattered to people she'd never know had been affected. The threads she'd woven that connected lives in patterns too complex to see from inside them. "But I'm still dying," she said, her voice breaking. "In a week I'll be gone, and none of this will matter, because I won't be here to do it anymore." Cale stopped walking and turned to face her fully. His enormous presence filled the space, but for the first time it didn't feel threatening. It felt like being seen, really seen by something that understood seeing better than most humans ever could. Death does not erase what you've done. Those threads you wove still exist. The people you helped still carry the benefits of your help. The ripples you created still spread outward. Your death ends your ability to create new threads, yes, but it doesn't unweave the ones you've already made. They remain. You remain in the effects of your life. That is what it means to matter. Not to be remembered by name, but to have changed the world in ways that continue after you're gone. Sarah felt tears on her face, impossible tears from a body too dried out to produce them. But there they were, hot and real and proof that she could still feel something other than the emptiness of the wasting sickness. I wish I'd known this before. Wish I'd understood that what I did mattered. I wasted so much time thinking I was worthless. You weren't alone in that. Cale's voice held something that might have been sadness. Most people live their entire lives never understanding their own value. They compare themselves to the loud ones, the powerful ones, the ones whose names are written in histories. They think that's what mattering means. They never see the quiet work that holds the world together. The seamstresses, the farmers, the servants, the people who do necessary work without recognition. They're the foundation everything else is built on. But they die thinking they didn't matter because no one wrote songs about them. He paused. I've watched this for 300 years. Watched countless people live and die, never knowing how much they mattered. It is one of the great tragedies of existence that most people cannot see themselves clearly, cannot understand their own value. That's why I stay here. Why I show truth to those brave enough to enter. Because if I can help even one person understand that their life has meaning, then 300 years of waiting is worth it. Can you help me? The question came out small, frightened. Can you make it so I don't waste my last days thinking I'm worthless? I already have. Cale gestured to the memories still swirling around them. You've seen the truth of your life now. You've seen the threads you've woven. That knowledge doesn't leave you. You'll carry it for whatever time remains. And perhaps if you choose, you can weave a few more threads before the end. Not because you have to prove anything, but because you now understand that what you do matters. Sarah looked at her hands, thin and trembling, but still capable of holding a needle. I have a week, maybe less. I can't finish any commissions. Can't start new work. What threads could I possibly weave? Cale smiled, an expression that transformed his strange face into something almost beautiful. There are other kinds of mending besides cloth. Other kinds of threads besides the ones you sew. You've seen how your work created ripples. You could create different ripples. Speak to people you've never spoken to. Share what you've learned here. Help others understand their own value before they die never knowing it. That is work too. Important work. Perhaps the most important work there is. The idea settled into her like a seed finding soil. She'd come here to die somewhere that mattered, but Cale was offering her something else. A chance to live her last days mattering in a different way. Not mending clothes, but mending understanding. Not weaving fabric, but weaving connections between people and their own worth. It was work she'd never considered because she'd never thought she had anything to offer beyond her needle. But now, having seen the truth of her own life, maybe she had something else to give. Knowledge, perspective, the hard-won understanding that quiet work mattered, even when the world said it didn't. How do I do that? How do I help others see what you showed me? By doing what you did. Cale moved his hand, and the memories faded, leaving only darkness again. You entered this hall because you were brave enough to face fear. You can help others be brave enough to face their own truths. You can be the voice that says your quiet work matters. Your invisible labor has value. You are not worthless just because no one notices you. He paused. I've been that voice for 300 years, but I'm trapped in this hall. I can only speak to those who enter, and almost no one enters. You could be that voice in the world. For a week, maybe less, but that might be enough. One person hearing that their life matters can change their entire existence. Imagine if you helped multiple people understand that before you die. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Not the desperate purpose of someone trying to pack meaning into their last days, but real purpose. The kind that came from understanding you had something to offer, even if that something was just truth spoken clearly. She looked up at Cale, at this shadow king who'd waited 300 years to help people see themselves clearly. Thank you. You're welcome. And Sarah? He tilted his head in that almost curious gesture. You noticed me. When you entered this hall, you didn't just see darkness. You saw me. You acknowledged my presence. That matters too. I exist in shadows, forgotten by the world. And you saw me anyway. That is its own kind of mending, its own kind of thread between us. I will remember you. And in remembering, I will ensure that your existence continues beyond your death. Not in history books or songs, but in the consciousness of something that persists. You will not be forgotten. Not by me. The promise hit her harder than all the memories had. She would die, yes, but she wouldn't be erased. Something would remember. Something would know she'd existed, that she'd mattered, that she'd been brave enough to face shadows when everyone else turned away. It wasn't immortality, but it was enough. She left the Hall of Echoes as dawn broke over the city, light touching the 7 hills and turning them gold. The door closed behind her softly, and the weight returned, warning others away. But she didn't feel it any more. Couldn't feel it because she'd already pushed through and found what was waiting on the other side. She walked through the waking city with purpose in her step despite the wasting sickness eating her from inside. She had a week, maybe less. And she knew exactly how she wanted to spend it. She went first to the lower districts, to the neighborhoods where workers lived, the servants and laborers and craftspeople who kept the city functioning but were never acknowledged. She found them in markets and on street corners, in early morning moments before their work began, and she spoke to them, told them their work mattered, that the quiet things they did held the world together, that being invisible didn't mean being worthless. Some dismissed her as a madwoman, but others listened, really listened. and she could see the moment when something shifted in them, when they began to consider that maybe they'd been wrong about their own value. She found a woman scrubbing steps in a wealthy household, work that would be undone the next day and the day after that forever. The woman looked exhausted, defeated, like she was going through motions she'd long since stopped caring about. Sarah sat beside her and said, "What you're doing matters." The woman laughed bitterly. "Scrubbing steps? No one notices, no one cares." But Sarah said, "They notice when it's not done. They notice when things fall apart. You're maintaining order, creating small pockets of cleanliness in a dirty world. That's sacred work." The woman stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. But later that day, Sarah saw her scrubbing with more attention, more care, as if the work had gained meaning it hadn't held before. She found a man repairing cobblestones on a street no nobles would ever walk. He worked slowly, methodically, replacing stones that had cracked or come loose. Sarah watched him work for a few minutes, then said, "You're building something that lasts. These stones will be here long after you're gone. People will walk on your work for generations and never know your name, but they'll benefit from your care." The man looked at her, surprised. "Never thought of it that way. Just seemed like work that needed doing." "That's the most important kind," Sarah replied. "The work that needs doing even when no one's watching." She spent 3 days doing this, moving through the city, finding the invisible people, the ones whose work went unnoticed and unappreciated. She told them variations of what Cale had told her, that quiet work mattered, that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless, that the world needed people who did necessary things without recognition more than it needed people who did dramatic things with fanfare. Most people dismissed her, but some listened, and those who listened changed, even if only slightly, stood a little straighter, worked with a little more pride, began to see themselves as necessary rather than invisible. On the 4th day, the wasting sickness got worse. Sarah woke up unable to walk without help, her body finally beginning the final collapse. Her landlady helped her to a chair by the window, and Sarah sat there watching the city move below, too weak to join it any more. She thought about going back to the Hall of Echoes, about dying there in the darkness with Cale's presence as witness. But she didn't have the strength to make the journey. Instead, she asked her landlady to bring her sewing supplies. "One last piece of mending," she said. "One last thread." Her landlady brought a basket of garments that needed repair, clothes from the boarding house's residents. Simple work, torn seams and missing buttons and hems that had come loose. Sarah chose a child's coat, something a young boy wore to school every day. It was worn almost to the point of uselessness, but with the right mending, it could last another year. She threaded her needle with trembling hands and began to work. Each stitch took forever. Her fingers barely responded, her vision blurred. Her breath came in shallow gasps. But she continued, pulling thread through fabric with the same care she'd always used. She fixed the torn lining, reinforced the seams, replaced buttons that were hanging by threads. It took her all day, work that should have taken an hour. But when the sun set, the coat was mended, perfect, ready for another year of use by a child who would never know how much effort had gone into saving his coat from the rag pile. She handed it to her landlady with a smile. "This is important work," she said. "Make sure he knows that." Make sure he understands that someone cared enough to make this perfect for him." The landlady took the coat with tears in her eyes. "I'll tell him. I promise." That night, Sarah felt the wasting sickness reach its conclusion. Her body was shutting down, preparing for the final silence. She lay in her narrow bed and thought about the week she'd had, about entering the Hall of Echoes, about Cale showing her the truth of her life, about the people she'd spoken to, the small changes she'd helped create, about the coat she'd mended with her last strength. It had been a good week, a meaningful week. She'd done what she could with the time she had. As consciousness began to fade, she felt something, a presence familiar and vast. Cale's attention reaching out from the Hall of Echoes across the city to find her. He couldn't leave the hall, couldn't be physically present, but he could witness, could make sure she didn't die alone, could remember. She felt his enormous focus wrap around her like a blanket, gentle despite its weight. She heard his voice not in her ears but in her mind. "You did well. You wove strong threads. They will last. You matter. You mattered. You will be remembered." And then she was gone, slipping away into whatever came after with the certainty that she'd lived a life worth living, that she'd mattered even if the world never knew her name, that she'd been seen, really seen, by something that understood the value of being seen. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The news of her death reached the Hall of Echoes through channels no living person understood. Cale felt it, felt the moment when her thread ended, when her presence winked out of the world. He sat in his darkness and mourned in the way shadows mourn, silently and completely. Then he did what he'd promised. He remembered, added her to the collection of people who'd entered his hall and left changed. Sarah Van, seamstress, 24 years old, who'd been brave enough to face darkness and wise enough to use her last days spreading the truth she'd learned. She would not be forgotten, not by him, and as long as he existed, her name would be spoken in the shadows whenever someone asked, who had been brave enough to enter when everyone else turned away. In the city, the ripples of her last week continued. The woman who scrubbed steps worked with new purpose, and her children noticed the change, learned from it. The man who repaired cobblestones began teaching apprentices, passing on not just the skill but the philosophy that necessary work was sacred work. The boy whose coat she'd mended wore it for 3 more years, long after he'd outgrown it, because his mother had told him that someone had cared enough to make it perfect for him, and that care deserved respect. Small ripples. Quiet changes, the kind of effects that never made histories but held the world together nonetheless. And in the Hall of Echoes, Cale waited in his darkness, watching through cracks in the door, hoping that someday another brave soul would enter. Another person who needed to see the truth of their life before they died, not knowing. Another invisible person who deserved to understand that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. He would wait as long as it took. 300 years had taught him patience. 300 years had taught him that the wait was worth it when someone like Sarah walked through his door and reminded him why he'd made his vow in the first place. Years passed. The current king heard rumors of the Hall of Echoes, of the shadow that waited there, of the truths it showed to those brave enough to enter. He considered investigating, considered entering the hall and facing whatever had terrified his predecessor 6 decades earlier. But he felt the weight at the door, the presence warning him away, and he chose differently. He unsealed the hall officially, removed the remaining restrictions, and posted a simple sign at the entrance for those brave enough to seek truth. Enter if you dare. Most people still stayed away. The weight was still there, the sense of being watched by something vast and patient. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone would enter. Someone with nothing left to lose. Someone with questions about their own worth. Someone brave or desperate or curious enough to push through fear and seek what waited in the darkness. And when they entered, Cale was there, waiting, ready to show them what they needed to see, ready to help them understand that their lives mattered in ways they'd never suspected, ready to weave them into the collection of people he remembered, ensuring they would never be truly forgotten. The Hall of Echoes remained, the Shadow King remained, and the truth remained, waiting in darkness for anyone brave enough to seek it. That quiet work mattered. That invisible people held the world together. That being seen, really seen, by something that understood seeing was worth any amount of fear. And that sometimes the most important thing you could do with your last days was help others understand their own value before they died, never knowing it. Every hidden soul carries a fire that breaks rules, awakens kings, and bends destiny. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever thought your quiet work didn't matter, if you've ever wondered whether your life has value when no one seems to notice, share your story in the comments below. Let this be a space where the unseen find voices, where the quiet workers understand they're sacred, where those who've entered darkness find others who survived it. Remember to leave a like if this story reminded you that being overlooked doesn't mean being worthless, that the threads you weave matter even when you can't see the pattern they create. And subscribe to walk this path with others who know that the bravest thing you can do is face truth, especially the truth about your own value. Until the next story, tend your threads. Do your quiet work with pride. Remember that being seen by the right eyes changes everything.